Namaskar, hello and welcome to P Guru's channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. Today I have a new guest with me, Abhinav Pandya. Before I give you a detailed intro about him, let's first welcome him to our channel. Abhinav, welcome to P Guru's channel.
Thank you so much. Namaskar.
Abhinav Pandya, a Cornell University graduate in public affairs, is a strategic affairs analyst specializing in counterterrorism, Indian foreign policy, and Afghanistan-Pakistan geopolitics. He has written for the Vivekananda International Foundation, a premier think tank of India in national security. He also writes for Haaretz Israel, Sunday Guardian, South Asia Democratic Forum, Perspectives on Terrorism, the Express Tribune of Pakistan, Huffington Post, Fair Observer of United States, Indian Military Review, Indian Defense Review, Policy Perspectives Foundation India, The Print, First Post, and Economic Times India. For VIF, he wrote critical papers on post-ISIS terrorism scenario, terror financing, and the use of bitcoins in terror financing. He is currently undertaking a comprehensive research project on terror financing in Jammu and Kashmir for his upcoming book on this subject. He is based in Udaipur, India, and is a freelance researcher. He advised Mr. Satyapal Malik, the then governor of Jammu and Kashmir, on radicalization and the jihadist organizations in Kashmir. He has also advised him on youth engagement and outreach. In the past, Abhinav has worked as a consultant with the United Nations and civil society in the United States and India. He's a St. Stephen's graduate, and he's also got an MS from Cornell University, United States. So, Abhinav, today's topic that we're going to talk about is on, no surprise here, Kashmir, and we're going to talk about the involvement of Turkey and Iran in Kashmir and what is their motivation to be involved in Kashmir's political affairs. So, Abhinav, first off, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you started your career in, you were a St. Stephen's graduate, then you went to the United States, and when did you decide to come back to India, and what has been happening for the past few years? Also, maybe a couple of lines about the book you're writing.
Thank you so much, Sri, for the wonderful introduction. And I'm really honored, to be on P Gurus. This is such a great platform. We have watched your videos in the past, and I never knew that today, someday, even I would be sitting with you on the same show talking about Kashmir, which has been a really favorite topic of mine for study and for my research. So, answering your question, I was in US until 2016. I finished my master's from Cornell in 2012, and then I was in New York City and DC. For a while I came back to India. I was working with ILO in Delhi, and then I went back to US. Again, I was in New York City and DC just trying to find jobs and everything. Okay. Then I wrote some papers for the UN Counterterrorism Committee. They were the part of my assignment, but I was also trying to find something with them. But then 2016, I had to come back to India for some family issues. And when I came back, I initially came back to my hometown, which is Udaipur in Rajasthan. And I was working here as a strategic advisor with an education NGO, and I was pretty much happy here. But then my father, he comes from the police background, and one fine day, one of his senior, who is retired now, he visited a house and he asked me my interest, and I told him about my real interest and my expertise. Then he put me in touch with the people at Vivekananda International Foundation, and from there this journey started. So initially I was working under the supervision of Mr. C.D. Sahai, who is the former chief of RNAW, that is India's External Intelligence Service, and I wrote many papers. He's a distinguished fellow at VIF. So I wrote many papers on terror financing and a couple of articles. But then it was decided to start a project on radicalization, of which Kashmir was one of the case study. And I chose Kashmir because I'd never been to that place, and staying in US, I was staying in Ithaca, which is a very snowy place. So I thought that I would get a chance again to be back in a place which closely resembles Ithaca. So that's how my journey with Kashmir started. So I think 2017, my first visit to Kashmir for this book project on radicalization. And then I stayed there for about a month, came back, submitted my briefings here at the Vivekananda International Foundation. Then I think next year, Mr. Malik was appointed as the governor. So somehow I got the opportunity to brief him on the Kashmir affairs, and then he is a very visionary man and a good statesman. So I mean, very something which is very unlikely in the Indian political circles. Because he said that, well, I want your expertise, and why don't you come and I would say sometimes keep advising me on Kashmir, like on the issues on which you are researching. So I was regularly visiting Kashmir and even staying there for prolonged periods of time. So I got this chance to advise him on various issues. And those were the times when Pulwama happened, Kashmir was going through intense radicalization phase, and then Article 370 was abrogated. So the journey just continued that way, and I was able to develop a very fine understanding of Kashmir because I was working on the grassroots and for my book on the radicalization and also this upcoming book on terror financing. I just tried to, I would say, break new grounds in terms of research because so far it's a conflict area. So the kind of research which has been coming from Kashmir that mostly hovers around secondary sources because it's difficult to go and stay there. But I was lucky enough to get good support in Kashmir. I stayed there for prolonged periods of time and interviewed multiple stakeholders from different kinds of backgrounds, including former militants, OGWs, people who are currently active in Hawala financial dealings and terror financing, and the mainstream politicians, the separatist leaders, and all those things resulted initially in my first book, then a couple of papers, and now the second book is coming, Terror Financing on Kashmir. At the same time, I was like when I was working in Kashmir, mostly the strategic analyst in Delhi and like even the security forces, they focused majorly on Pakistani backed terrorist groups in Kashmir and the radicalization, the organizations engaged in radicalization. But I came across new phenomena, new trends emerging in Kashmir, which were hinting more towards the internationalization of the Kashmir issue. And Turkey was one of the most prominent players emerging very fast in Kashmir. Initially, I think I mean the idea did not get much traction in the Indian policy making circles because the people here still felt that the Turkey is the camelist Turkey, and it's like that old secular version of Turkey who is a member of NATO, and we cannot expect that kind of radicalization initiatives or jihadist measures coming from Turkey. But then, like now, after the abrogation of Article 370, everyone saw Erdogan's activism, and we know what role they are playing. So that's, I mean, my journey on Kashmir. Like I just mentioned like what I did so far.
Well, to make things very interesting, Bitcoin is at an all-time high, $52,000 per coin now, and that's a lot of money, and that goes a long way in India, where you multiply it by 72 or something like that, and you get a whole load of rupees in your hand to splurge. Now, I wrote a book. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it. It's actually an Amazon bestseller, more because I guess I was lucky. So this talks about fake currency and how fake currency found its way into India, and it also talks about an alternate scenario for why demonetization had to be done. Any rate, so for me, financing, money, terrorism, money laundering, all these terror financing, these are things that are a lot of interest to me. So I'm really looking forward to some very interesting information from you. So let me just walk back to the time when the then government of Mehbooba Mufti got dismissed, and then the state went into a sort of a limbo. Nobody knew what was going to happen, and then the Article 370 was abrogated. Now, I read one of the articles about this time period, and the local population in the Kashmir Valley, they were saying that, look, for this decision, it was completely kept secret, and many in Kashmir didn't even know that it was going to happen, and everybody was thinking something else, and this happened. So my thought when I saw that question was, this is an earth-shaking event. Why would they want to reveal it to anybody? It is going to be kept secret. Of course, it has to be kept secret. So what were your observations around that time period when 370 dropped like a bombshell, they were perhaps thinking 35A will go, which is like a small incremental step. But the whole 9 yards went. That was like, my goodness, now there is nothing. We are not special anymore. I mean, that is just one thought. I'll tell you one real shocking moment for me. I was a college student and I had gone to Kashmir twice. One in 1974 when I was still in school, and once in 1979 when I was in college. And in 79, I went in December. You know how December in the valley can be. The sun barely peaks out by 10 a.m. and it's gone by 3 p.m. And not much can be done. But, chose the wrong time to be there, but it was freezing, freezing. But any rate, so whenever I would go out and buy something or, try to make small talk, the frequent phrase that I used to hear from the local people, like I'll buy a cup of coffee or something, and then they'll, exchange money, and they'll say, "Oh, aap to India se hain." It used to feel weird. What is this? Why are they saying this? And this is 1979, by the way, and I can imagine that things kind of slid downhill. So walk us through what happened during that time, and then perhaps you can tell us what is the situation now and all these other nexi that's in play, Afghanistan, Iran, and so on and so forth. I mean, Turkey and Iran and so forth.
Thank you so much, Sri. It's a very interesting question. I would love to answer that because I just came from a month and a half long trip in Kashmir, and I'll just share my observations. Okay? So first of all, I would like to say that abrogating Article 370, I mean, it was a strategic and a security compulsion. Most of the people would brand it as some kind of a part of a manifesto of BJP, okay, and National Conference would criticize it as I would say India's dictatorial imposition. PDP would say something else. Congress would also criticize it as the political agenda of BJP. But let me say, I mean, whatever the people say, or even the political parties may be having their own compulsions, including the BJP, because it has been the part of their agenda. But the very fact is that, which we really need to understand, is that it was a very, I would say, required strategic and a security compulsion, because Kashmir was passing through such a phase. If we had not done something like this, it would have gone completely like a Syria way or Iraq way. It was on that level of radicalization, especially after 2011. I mean, it all started in 2018 when Masarrat Alam started copying the Intifada tactics of Palestinians, and they started stone pelting in Kashmir. I mean, I'll just give one example. Now, imagine Amarnath Rao, Amarnath agitation. Small part of land was transferred to the Amarnath temple, and the whole valley was up in flames. I mean, just imagine the level of intolerance. This was the place which is the cradle of, I would say, Indian civilization, Sanatan civilization. Kashmiri Pandits were living in that place for, I would say, centuries. It was, I mean, they were the common, I would say, inheritors of Kashmir along with the other faiths. But when a small tract of land was transferred to Amarnath temple, and the level of agitation witnessed in the valley, that simply shows the levels of radicalization which Pakistan and its proxies were building up in Kashmir. Then after 2011, when the Arab Spring happened in the Middle East, Kashmir was majorly coming under the influence of the pan-Islamist ideological forces. Okay, until then, I mean, it was I wouldn't say it wasn't jihad. It was the jihad was always a subtext of the Kashmir movement, but it was more or less localized. But after this Arab Spring, many factors came up. The social media and especially what happened in the Arab world had a major influence in the mindset of Kashmiris. Okay, because it certainly concerned something with the Islamic countries. And after 2011, what we witnessed in Kashmir was the emergence of this whole pan-Islamist ideology and liking for organizations like Al-Qaeda, I would say, and the doctrines of political Islam, caliphate mindset. So Kashmir was going through that kind of ideology. And even in 2017, if you just understand the security situation right before the abrogation of Article 370, you would come across local affiliates of Al Qaeda, which was Ansar Ghazwatul Hind, headed by a certain gentleman called Zakir Musa. And Zakir Musa had become a celebrity militant in Kashmir. Even 7 to 8 year old kids were, singing songs in his praise, and they were chanting Musa Army Zindabad, Musa Army Zindabad. I have visited schools of Kashmir. I know I would say middle schools, high schools, where I would say 10th if you visit a class 10th room, study room, or even a class 8 study room, you would see graffiti like Zakir Musa Zindabad. I was interviewing I would say class 10 students once for my previous book, and they were about 50 students. I asked them, "What do you want to become in your life?" Okay. About 42 students, like in the class of 50, they said that, well, we want to become either Burhan Wani, we want to become Zakir Musa, and this is all about Islam. I told them that whether you would welcome Kashmiri Pandits in the valley. They said that no, we can't welcome them. No, they cannot come here. No. Then I asked them that whether you would like Rohingyas to settle down here. Most of them said yes. I said why? They said that, well, this is about the Islamic Brotherhood. So there was the level of radicalization which was happening in Kashmir. And for that matter, I would like to mention about Burhan Wani. If you watch Burhan Wani's videos before his death, he is talking about caliphate. Even his brother Manan Wani, who is normally projected by many scholars, especially intellectuals, as some kind of PhD scholar, if you carefully read the letter which he wrote, before joining militancy, in that letter he's openly talk about the Islamic Caliphate and I would say the Islamic system of governance in society. So Kashmir was going through that kind of radicalization. Then we have Pulwama suicide bombing, something which was totally unexpected. Before that, the locals never volunteered for suicide bombing. And this major suicide bombing trend was coming up in Kashmir, and a local volunteered for it, which was one of the most brutal suicide bombing acts. And then Pakistan wanted to do many more like that after that incident. Jaish, if you read the charge sheet of the Pulwama suicide bombing case, you will find that Jaish was planning many other attacks after that. And we have evidences. There was such a plan, which was a plan for conducting the suicide bombing, which was busted in Banihal later. So, I mean, just giving you a brief, I would say, glimpse of what Kashmir was before the abrogation of Article 370. And besides that, Pakistan had created a very strong, I would say, constituency in Kashmir, which included almost every actor. That included radical organizations like Jamaat-e-Islami, which are religious organizations but very extremist in nature. But they function in an open daylight because, they are registered organizations and they claim to be religious ones. But they are primarily the feeder organizations for militant groups like Hizbul Mujahideen, even for that matter, Lashkar. Then you had mainstream politicians who were fulfilling the agenda of Pakistan. They were having dubious loyalties. Okay. If you see PDP's support base is entirely dependent on Jamaat-e-Islami. And Jamaat-e-Islami decide the postings in the administration, in the police. Then you had media, which is like, heavily influenced by Pakistan proxies, and they had media groups like Greater Kashmir and all, who were talking openly about the separatist narrative. So Pakistan had created such intense penetration in the various institutions of states like the education, media, charity organizations. So India was left with no option. If we had not abrogated Article 370, we would have gone into a phase where we would be witnessing a spate of suicide bombings in Kashmir and very ISIS-like phenomenon in Kashmir. Oh, there was the Kashmir right before the abrogation of Article 370. And after now coming to the phase after the abrogation of Article 370, I must say, well, security forces and the administration did a wonderful job, because Kashmir has been peaceful for the last 1.5 years, like 1.5 years, relatively peaceful. Okay? And coming back to your original question, that why was it kept a secret? Okay, well, this is a step, first of all, okay, let me just go back to one more fundamental question that, whether India had the right to do it or not. It took, bringing in Article 370 was decided by Indian Parliament. It was a temporary measure, okay, and it could be abrogated by Indian Parliament if we had the sufficient majority. We could have done that long back in 1960s. We denuded Article 370 of many of its provisions, but then a semblance continued, which in a way shielded a coterie of conflict elites, terror financiers, separatists. So it became a compulsion for us to get rid of this peace, to bring peace and prosperity in Kashmir. It was hindering the economic development of Kashmir. Your CBI could not go to Kashmir and investigate endless corruption cases, scams in which the state governments were indulging in. The West Pakistani refugees who were in Kashmir for about last 5 decades, and they were the legitimate people who came from Pakistan and settled in Kashmir, but they had no voting rights. Females of Kashmir who would marry outside the state, they did not get any property rights. SC, ST communities, they had no rights in Kashmir. The minorities were suffering. We already know about how Pandits were, forced out of Kashmir. Even the Sikh minority Sikh minority in Kashmir, they are facing a systematic discrimination. If you go to Kashmir University or various other educational institutions in Kashmir, the minorities are facing heavy discrimination.
So
So it
how
was
do
a
you?
compulsion and you could do it.
Okay, finish your thought. I have a question. Please finish your
Yes,
thought.
sure.
Yeah.
So, and why it was kept hidden, it was, I mean, it had to be planned in such a manner that there are no casualties. Okay? And I mean, given the fact that the matter is so sensitive and so critical, Pakistan would have done anything, like, they would have gone to their extreme levels to organize a massive terrorist attack or massive, I would say, social unrest. Okay? And why the mainstream political leaders and Hurriyat leaders were arrested before? They were not, I would say that they were arrested, but they were not tortured or interrogated. They were put under house arrest. So all the lockdown which we talk generally, I mean, which is criticized, the security and communication lockdown, it was precautionary in nature. It was not a punitive measure. And these guys were arrested because if we had not done that, they could have mobilized thousands of people in seconds, I would say, maybe in an hour or so. And those thousands of people, completely financed, sponsored by Pakistani proxies, and they would have come in protest. There would have been cases of police firing and civilian casualties. So, just to organize and implement this change in a peaceful manner, these people were put under house arrest, but they were allowed to meet their relatives. And even for the common people, there were internet kiosks across the various urban areas. Okay, and people were delivered, I would say, proper, public utility facilities even after the abrogation of Article 370. You will surprise that the Eid festival, which came a few days after the abrogation of Article 370, was celebrated very peacefully in Kashmir. Divisional Commissioner Bashir Khan was personally delivering sacrificial lambs from door to door. Medical facilities were perfectly fine. And then, yes, coming to the communication lockdown, internet shutdown took place because mostly these terrorist organizations use internet for their secret communications, arranging logistics. So to prevent a terror attack and also to prevent mobilization of people for a massive social protest through internet applications, this measure was taken, that too as a completely precautionary measure. And
Uh,
now we have 4G internet is back in Kashmir. Okay.
Now, speaking of applications, one of the interviews that I had done with another gentleman, Savio Rodriguez, and he had said that Pakistan had pushed so many cell phones with so many new applications that the intelligence services were finding it difficult to even decode what was a communicator app and what was, because they were not using WhatsApp, they were using something else. I mean, it's possible to have custom apps, it's not that hard. The thing that he said that blew him away was the fact that there were so many people with state of the art phones, and if you look at any picture that came from all the stone pelting and things like that, the kids are amazingly well dressed. They have like the best tennis shoes and jeans, and it all looks very high end. So one wonders, on the one side Kashmir kept saying that there is no economic development, there is no future for our children. But on the other side, they were all incredibly well dressed. And then that's when Savio told me, no, 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 these guys have been fed on a lot of money that was pushed across, and this money this cycle had to be broken. And at that time, one thing that he had said was that even though men were not coming across the border, there were still some women coming across, and because there were no women police at the checkpoints across the POK border, that there could have been some smuggling of arms through women, because if there was no checking. And he said that the government is fixing that also. So I think overall the central government has done a fantastic job keeping things under control. What is the most important thing here is moving forward. Now there is going to be some more time. The state is going to be still going to be a union territory, which in my opinion is right. In fact, I have criticized my vice president saying that you don't know the half of what is happening. And even I gave her an example. See, she's from California. In fact, she's like, her home is only like 40 miles from where I am. I said, there was a suburb in our area where there was a serial shooting. There were 2 or 3 people shooting at people in the mall, and the United States police shut down internet for 90 minutes to stop this thing from spreading further, because they did not know how many people were doing it, and it looked like it was a coordinated shooting where you shoot in one direction, the crowd goes into the it becomes more bunched up, and then there are more people there, and then they can induce much more casualties. So these things happen. If you have no other alternative, you're going to shut down the internet. But anyway, so the question now is, so it's now close to 18 months since 370 has been lifted. The government did some fundamentally different steps. They said they put money in the hands of village councils, panchayats, from district development councils and things like that. What is the on the ground situation now in Kashmir?
Thank you. I'll just, I'll begin answering this question by going back to something which I wanted to mention in my previous, I would say,
Sure.
answer, but just kind of forgot. After the abrogation of Article 370, there's one thing which we all need to understand is that, there was among the common ordinary masses, people were actually, a large segment was quite happy about it, in fact. Okay? I mean, they wouldn't express it, but they were actually quite happy. And one of the, I would say, most of the people had no idea what exactly the Article 370 entailed for them, what it meant for them, except for the fact that the outsiders cannot buy property in Kashmir. But apart from that, people were questioning that, we got no benefits from this Article 370 regime, which continued for 50 years. And all these elitist families, political families in Kashmir, the dynasts, so-called dynasts, they filled their coffers with all kinds of illegal money and corruption scams, and they were protected by this Article 370 regime. So when these mainstream politicians and the Hurriyat leaders, they were arrested, people were actually quite happy because they saw those highly arrogant politicians, who never gave any access to them and who just embezzled all the funds in the development schemes which came from Delhi for their personal, monetary interests or buying properties, maybe in Kashmir, maybe in Delhi, Gurgaon, Mumbai, or even in foreign countries. People were
Well,
happy for that.
Mehbooba Mufti's sister is the biggest dealer of cars in car dealership in Chennai. Please continue. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
go
even
ahead.
the
Yeah.
separatist Hurriyat leaders, they were dubious people. They were having dubious loyalties, and their own sons and daughters went to foreign universities for their studies. And you would be surprised that Mr. Gilani's, his relatives, his sons and daughters, they are working in the Jammu and Kashmir state government administration.
Hmm.
And they were inciting the common people to send their sons for stone pelting, who were dying at the hands of the police forces. So common people were very happy because these people were arrested and they had lost complete credibility, especially among the masses. In fact, I was talking to one person who is a former militant and currently, I mean, also mildly active, especially in the weapons, I would say OGW circles and all. He said that people will be more happy, like they will be happier if you or your government take these mainstream politicians out of the state and just put them in some jail in some remote location in Rajasthan or maybe Andaman Islands, because people are sick and tired of these mainstream politicians. So there was also a level of I would say reception, I would say, or acceptance for this kind of abrogation of Article 370. And after that, government has been like the situation on the, I would say, the human rights grounds, or I would say even on the security grounds, has been relatively peaceful. Okay, I'll just come back to the militancy part later, but let me just I would say deal with the what government has been doing.